Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha here with a new series that I'm going to kind of occasionally contribute to whenever people request a specific build to be examined. I'm going to go ahead and examine the build using whatever parameters that they happen to be talking about at the time. So we're starting this off with a request by Menzrick74, who wanted me to talk more about Conjurer, specifically in the context of a two-handed range with a pet focus. So that is going to be the opening episode here. I have another episode for this planned, so you will be seeing a second episode of this, so don't worry about that. But these aren't going to be very consistent, so just be aware of that. These will just be whenever people request an examination of the build. Now again, this isn't going to necessarily be considering item context beyond two-handed ranged. If you have an item you would like me to potentially build around, what I call a focused build, I would be willing to do that as well. If you maybe have a really cool item that you want to try to maximize, but you're not sure how you want to, throw it at me. I'll look at some options and, see if I can give you a salient recommendation. But in this particular context, Manzarek74 was specifically talking Conjurer, pets, two-handed range. So we have our three rules down. So this is what I would call a directed build. We have a general idea of where we want to take the build. It doesn't necessarily require specific items, so it's very much just these three rules that we'll be following. So I'm actually going to deviate slightly from the script and not recommend a 100% pet build in this particular scenario. You are looking at a two-handed gun, so you have a lot of potential punch that you can deliver to your enemies. So first, let's talk about some things that you absolutely should have here, and I want to address the pets right away. First off, actually, we're going a little bit gung-ho here. My first recommendation would be the crow. There are a couple of reasons for that. Well, actually, before we get to the crow, I want to talk about Primal Bond. Now, you obviously are looking to do pets, so Primal Bond is a really obvious pickup here. And this is just going to boost all your pets' damage, and it's going to increase your own bleeding physical and internal trauma damage. Now, you've got a couple of interesting options for dealing physical, internal trauma, and bleeding damage. First off, you are using a two-handed gun. I strongly recommend Brute Force. I'm going to talk about you first. So Brute Force with Feral Hunger, at the very least, will give you a little bit of occasional self-heal. A third of your attack damage is being converted to health. It's a two-handed weapon, so it's going to hit pretty hard. It's only 26% of the time, but I have an answer for that as well. And obviously Brute Force is going to increase your damage overall as well. It's going to give you some health. You're going to be a bit more durable than I think a lot of pet builds normally run, but that will come in handy as well. Now, Upheaval is also a really spicy thing to grab here. You're really going to be helping out your pets here, and again, there's a specific reason for that. Lightning damage is something you're not going to want to shy away from, and I'll get into that in a second, but at the very least, you are using a two-handed gun. Capitalize on it. Get Brute Force. Help your pets out. Now, this will benefit from the physical, internal trauma, and bleeding increases. You've got physical and internal trauma here. On Feral Hunger, you've got some bleed here. You've got your weapon damage. As long as your weapon is doing physical damage, ideally, I mean, most guns do piercing damage, at least to some percentage, which is fine. But your guns will potentially also be able to tack on some physical, internal trauma, or bleeding, depending on the gun that you're using. And then Upheaval, of course, it's even more bleeding damage, so I do recommend going into Upheaval. Even more weapon damage added onto a pretty much guaranteed special ability for free. This does not use any energy, so you don't need to worry about pulling energy away from a potential pet replacement. Now, back to the pets. There's going to be a temptation to go for Mogdragon's Pact, but honestly, considering you're using a two-handed ranged weapon, this is only going to affect the crow, which is the primary thing you're going to want to be pulling out of the occultist. Now, you're going to want to increase the crow all the way, at least a Storm Spirit. Now, considering you are going to be using a gun, the Lightning Strike is going to be a pretty good time as well. That way you and the crow can kind of set up a barrage of damage towards the enemy. This will also stun enemies, so should your front line die, and I'm going to talk about your front line in a hot second, should your front line die, you, or at the very least your crow, will be stunning enemies. Your crow will be increasing your lightning damage. You're not going to be doing a ton of lightning damage, obviously. You've got that really nice bleeding and physical and internal trauma increase, but Storm Spirit will take the lightning damage from Brute Force and add on to it, and both of you get lightning retaliation for desperate times. But the real... this is nice and all. This is all, you know, happy bonuses. Lightning Strike is nice. It'll help keep you alive. Storm Spirit will help increase your damage, but the real key here is Mend Flesh. Since Brute Force, or whatever that's the second stage is called, Feral Hunger. Since Feral Hunger isn't consistently healing you, it's only healing you about a quarter of the time, and even then only a third of your damage output, Mend Flesh from your crow is really going to be how you stay alive. It's 15% of your health. You're getting bonus health from your Brute Force anyways, so that's going to be a bit more of an extra healing. It's going to really help. But this is primarily what you're going to want to be pulling out, ideally, is the crow at the very least. And then my next recommendation would be Summon Briarthorn, max leveled, and just the Ground Slam. Now, the reason why you're not going to be going into Emboldening Presence is because your Briarthorn is going to be frontline. It's going to be your tank. And Emboldening Presence is only going to increase your Briarthorn. You and the Crow are not likely to get a lot of benefit from this, because you're going to be in the back line, probably out of range of Emboldening Presence. And we can use these points better elsewhere. Now, if you really want Emboldening Presence for the physical and bleeding resistance, that's fine. It will also increase the damage of your Briarthorn, but just understand that it's mostly only going to be affecting your Briarthorn, and your Briarthorn only really needs Ground Slam for the generation of additional threat. What this just means is that enemies will prioritize your Briarthorn over you or your Crow, regardless of damage output. And besides the fact, this is also doing physical and bleeding damage, which Primal Bond is increasing anyways. So, fairly nice, very nice here. And your Summon Briarthorn, your Briarthorn isn't going to be pulling much in the way of elemental damage off your Crow. Again, he's mostly going to be outside of the range of your Crow anyways. So, this is basically the purpose of your Briarthorn. Now, you may be wondering, okay, so it's just the one Briarthorn as a tank, and he's pulling extra aggro from Ground Slam. How am I keeping him alive? I've got the stun from the Crow, and the Crow obviously potentially can heal the Briarthorn as well if you're not taking too much damage, or if Feral Hunger is healing you enough to make it through the fight. It depends on how many ranged enemies there are at the time and how good of a job your Briarthorn is doing at attracting enemy attention. But the answer to this is a max level Primal Strike. At the very least, this version. Now, key here is the stun. This is the main clincher. You're doing physical damage, you're doing bleeding damage, and you're doing lightning damage. Your Primal Bond is boosting the physical bleeding. Your Crow is increasing the lightning. You're doing 260% of your weapon damage, whatever it happens to be, whether it be a lightning damage weapon, a lightning damage ranged weapon, or a physical ranged weapon, or a bleeding ranged weapon. You're enhancing something here. I would also strongly recommend Torrent, just primarily for the extra targets. Again, your Crow is going to be improving that lightning damage. It's a little bit more added damage onto it. It's going to spread out and stun more enemies, which is a pretty big deal. So, this will also really help keep your Briarthorn alive. Now, this has a pretty nice low cooldown. It's got only 3 seconds of recharge, but it can potentially stun targets for up to 4 seconds. Barring, you know, stun-immune bosses or particularly stun-immune heroes, which you'll occasionally encounter, and those will be a struggle. But beyond those stun-resistant rare heroes and bosses, Primal Strike is going to, theoretically, almost stun lock by itself. This doesn't even include the stun from the Crow. So, the Crow will be stunning enemies. You're going to be stunning enemies with Primal Strike and Torrent. If you really want to go ballistic on the damage and you really want to commit, I would recommend Storm Surge, but that's entirely your choice. You could devote these points towards the Emboldening Presence if you feel the Briarthorn needs it. But frankly, if you just blast enough Storm Surges at people, they're going to die anyways. You'll have to keep a little bit of an eye on your energy, especially if you do add Storm Surge. This is going to take up a bit more energy. It's 8 here. It's a good old... it's going to be 80 here. Does this actually factor this in? I can't remember if this... Nope, it does not. So that's going to be 88 if you go with Storm Surge. Not a huge cost, but remember you're going to be casting that every 3 seconds, literally. Less if you happen to have a decrease in your cooldowns, which, again, depends on your items, which I'm not getting into the specifics of here because you're more concerned with the broad improv here. So you can do either Storm Surge, which I personally prefer in this scenario. It does massively larger amounts of damage. This is quite a substantial change. That extra bleeding duration, by the way, really helps as well, because while your enemies are stunned, they're also bleeding out. Your Briarthorn is also inflicting bleeding damage, which is really nice. And of course, again, Primal Bond is increasing your bleeding damage even further. So basically, if they get unstunned, they're going to be so low on health in a lot of cases that there's really no point in being unstunned in the first place. But again, this is going to depend on how you find your Briarthorn doing. If your equipment, broadly speaking, improves the defenses of your pets, your Briarthorn isn't going to need Emboldening Presence. So which one of these two you pick is going to pretty much depend on whether or not your equipment enhances you, or your pet's damage, or your pet's defenses. So that's going to come down to your equipment very specifically, but one of these two definitely recommended. You could, if you really wanted to, let's assume you go with Storm Surge, because it is my personal favorite in this scenario. Like I said, you can't maximize Emboldening Presence as it is. I would recommend splashing a little bit of points into Mogdraken's Pact. Your Crow isn't really going to care that much, but this is primarily for the energy regeneration. That is the primary point here. Alternatively, you could splash these points into Curse of Frailty, which you'll notice decreases the physical resistance and bleeding resistance of victims, and it just blasts everyone with the curse in a 6-meter radius from your target. This will really help. Also, if your Briarthorn dies and the enemies are cursed, obviously it's decreasing their movement speeds. That's going to be even harder for them to get through to. So that can really help as well. Now, you don't necessarily have to go with this if you don't want to, but if you're using a two-handed gun, get the full Crow, get the, I would recommend getting the Briarthorn to at least Ground Slam. You don't necessarily need Brute Force. If you really wanted to dedicate yourself to much more of a concise pet setup, which you absolutely could. And Brute Force isn't necessary either. I mean, Feral Hunger works much better with melee, so you can drop that if you want. You could go with a couple of other options. You could actually maximize Curse of Frailty, but what might actually be more effective would be Storm Totems, which could really help deal out damage in time for your Briarthorn to not die, or you could instead upgrade the Primal Spirit. Now, what the Primal Spirit would do for you, yes, the Primal Spirit only lives for 20 seconds, which sounds like a long time, and in some situations it will be, but it's going to pass by pretty quick. The main point of Primal Spirit, if you decide you want this, is to basically fill in when your Briarthorn dies. So let's say you enter a fight, you've got your full HP Briarthorn, you fight for a while, Briarthorn dies. You resummon a new Briarthorn. Now this is a fairly substantial 18-second recharge. Alright? Now notice it's an 18-second recharge. You bust out a Primal Spirit here, and the Primal Spirit will support your Briarthorn at least long enough for the Summon Briarthorn skill to come back off cooldown. And then you can summon a new Briarthorn when the current one dies. So you can kind of use the Primal Spirit to ensure that even if your Briarthorn dies a second time, you've got something else between you and your enemy. The only real issue with this is that the Primal Spirit does not have anything that generates extra threat. There is no kind of taunt effect on the Primal Spirit. So once the Briarthorn dies, there's a pretty good chance that the enemies are going to come at you again, and the Primal Spirit will kind of be chasing them to you, and then you're just going to have this kind of melee ranged brawl, which isn't really what you want with a two-handed ranged weapon. So beware that that is going to be a potential issue here. But the Primal Spirit can be very effective in that context, and probably would suit your purposes a little bit better than the Storm Totem, but the Storm Totem is on the board here. Alternatively, and actually you can still do this even with the Primal Spirit, you can go with the Wendigo Totem. And this sounds like a crazy idea, but the Blood Pact does bleeding damage. Now the point of this primarily is to heal your Briarthorn. You slap this down, and it has Mend Wounds to anything within a 5-meter radius. So you put this right down next to wherever your Briarthorn is fighting, and it's going to heal your Briarthorn. It recharges in 5 seconds, and it lasts 15. So you slap down a Wendigo Totem, and whenever it's about to die, you just put a new one down. It's going to continuously heal your Briarthorn. It's not going to do a whole lot of damage because you're not really enhancing vitality in this setup. I mean, the bleeding is going to be nice out of the Blood Pact portion of this deal, and if you're going to go with the Wendigo Totem, you pretty much really should be going for Blood Pact, because you are enhancing bleeding, and this does a pretty impressive amount of bleeding damage with Blood Pact. I mean, without Blood Pact, it doesn't really do bleeding damage at all, so that's... Go for Blood Pact if you're going to go for this, commit full all the way. But that is going to be something that you could really actually go with and find very useful. So I would, if your Briarthorn is having a hard time, and you don't want to go with Brute Force because it just doesn't work out for you, which is possible, then the Wendigo Totem with Blood Pact is going to be really great. If you really don't want to go with the Primal Spirit, if you find that doesn't work, I would suggest trying Curse of Frailty. Physical resistance down, bleeding resistance down, it's a magical time. You probably won't need vulnerability. You're not really doing much in the way of poison acid resistance. You're not really doing much in the way of vitality. I mean, you could still go for this because the vitality and elemental resistance is nice. You could put a couple of points in here if you really wanted to. One thing I would really recommend not going with is the Hellhound, primarily because it will eventually enhance chaos and fire damage, although it does do some really nice chaos and fire damage. Again, you're not really enhancing that much. It's not really that big of a deal. So, unless you want to go for a unusual, but still possibly effective chaos focus, which is something I'm actually going to talk about for a second if you wanted to go with that instead. If you want to do a very interesting, different version of this, a non-Primal Bond version, you could have the alternate options of going for, although this is really more for melee, but I figured I would talk about it just in case, just for the kick, just for the magical kicks. So if you want to really go in for a chaos version of this, we're still leaving the Briarthorn as it is. We actually would go with Emboldening Presence here. Go for the Hellhound. Go for the Hellhound, max the Hellhound. You can go for Bonds Abysmal. Now, if you're really dedicated, drop the Crow, and this is going to be a bit of a different setup here. And you can theoretically use this with a two-handed gun, but you would basically be trying to run up into the enemy's face, trying to bolster yourself using the Emboldening Presence from your Briarthorn, the Hellfire from your Hellhound, go into Possession, and that's an option as a potential item. Now the problem here is, again, this is primarily really geared for a melee. This is basically the melee version. If you get tired of the two-handed gun, or if the two-handed gun isn't working out for you, this is the melee version that I would recommend that you could try. You could alternatively go for the Briarthorn Emboldening Presence and go for Mend Flesh up to the Crow here. So, as an alternative example, and this is really the best way to use manipulation here, by the way. You could do, of course, a bit of a flex. I bust out the Consecrated Blade because it does improve your pets, but you absolutely don't have to do that. You could go into Sickle of Consumption and Destruction instead, which the Hellhound boosts, and gives you a great self-heal as well. Actually, that probably in the long run would be better, but the Soil's Witchfire is a bit more pet-focused. But basically, if you wanted to do a melee version of the build that I showed you earlier, of what I recommended for the ranged version, you still stick with Primal Bond. You still have your Briarthorn. You still have the Crow, but this time you're only going up to the Mend Flesh here. And if you go melee with the Crow and the Briarthorn, you could go Wendigo Totem, Blood Pact, and I'm not going to assume you're going to use a two-handed if you go melee. Blood of Dreeg, Aspect of the Guardian, and Conjure Primal Spirit, and I think still you would want to go for Curse of Frailty and Vulnerability. And the Crow is basically just there to keep you and your pets alive. It heals in an area, so it'll heal all of you at the same time. And then basically you're going to be running with the Briarthorn and the Primal Spirit, and you're going to be basically also self-healing off of Blood of Dreeg. You're going to be giving you and your pets Acid Retaliation, and extra Vitality and Poison damage as well. Now, your Briarthorn obviously isn't going to be getting a whole lot of that. Your Vitality damage is going to be enhancing the Wendigo Totem, though, and your Poison damage is going to be enhancing the Primal Spirit. So you have a couple of different options, but if I were, like I said, if you were going to go with two-handed ranged, specifically, I would recommend maxing the Crow, leaving... Oh. I just want to kind of conclude the build analysis. I want to go to what my essential ultimate recommendation would be. Go up to this far, just pull the Crow, maybe Curse of Frailty if you really want it, go Primal Bond, don't need Emboldening Presence here. Not Wendigo Totem, but I would absolutely go for absolutely massive amounts of Primal Strike. And I would go with at least this. Now, this leaves you 37 points. Now, how you want to spend these 37 points, I'm going to leave my recommendation like this. I would recommend this so far. Primal Bond, Primal Strike, max all of this. Summon Briarthorn, Ground Slam, max Raven, everything. And then, at this point, with your remaining 37 points, you decide what to do with the 37 points based on what you see being an issue in your build so far. And this is also going to depend on your items as well. There is a large amount of Shaman items that increase Mogdragon's Pact, and it's not a bad idea. It helps. It gets you energy regeneration. It increases your health regeneration. It's not a bad thing. If you want to increase Heart of the Wild, maybe. Not necessarily a bad idea. If the items you can take or leave, and your Briarthorn is dying a lot, Emboldening Presence, just to keep your Briarthorn alive a little bit better. Or Wendigo Totem with Blood Pact, one of the two. If you find that these aren't helping, none of these are helping, and your Briarthorn just dies regardless, Primal Spirit to kind of support your Briarthorn in its hour of need, for just the 20 seconds that you need to either get that cooldown back online, or maybe just for bosses, bust out the Primal Spirit for bosses if you're having a problem with bosses, which you probably will. Primal Strike doesn't do great against bosses because it's really intended for large clusters of enemies. And by the way, whatever you do, do not take Thunder Strike. It completely removes the stun, which is one of the things that's going to keep your Briarthorn alive. Your Primal Strike plus Lightning Strike from your Crow should theoretically be almost constant stun locking. Most of the time. There's going to be occasional moments because this is only a it does have a minimum 2.6 seconds and has a 3-second recharge. So there is going to be the occasional enemy that's not going to be stunned for, it's going to be out for 0.4 seconds, where it's not going to be stunned, but that's not really going to be a huge problem. You can just Primal Strike. Right afterwards, it's going to get off an attack or two. But this is going to be sort of the core, and then from there you just decide how you want to adjust. Like I said, if you're having a problem with bosses, Primal Spirit and Curse of Frailty will really help with that. Curse of Frailty will just really help overall. If you are having a problem with large groups, Bloody Pox is actually a pretty good pickup. That's reduction to enemies' health and bleeding damage. Going up to wasting increases the bleeding damage even further. Not a bad pickup. If you find your Briarthorn needs just a little bit of help, Wendigo Totem, Blood Pact, give your Briarthorn some healing besides the Crow. Again, the Primal Spirit is just so good against bosses if you need that. Another alternative to that would be potentially using Savagery if you want to. That does lightning and bleeding damage, which you're going to be enhancing. You've got health regeneration here. You're using a two-handed gun. You could use Might of the Bear here. And you could go to Storm Touch to get lots of attack speed, get some lightning retaliation for emergency situations, extra damage there. If you want this to be your solution to bosses, that works. If you do want to stick with the Brute Force because it just works, that's fine. It's at least worth trying. But you've got a lot of options here, but your core skills are going to be a completely maxed out Primal Strike, max everything. Summon Briarthorn to Ground Slam. Ground Slam primarily so it can draw the attention of enemies more often. Primal Bond to both enhance you and your pets, so you can actually do some pretty good damage out there and not just 100% rely on your pets, which is always dangerous. Just like with investments, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And the Crow to both heal you for when you need it, and increase your lightning damage, so that way all of your damage is being enhanced from physical, internal trauma, bleeding, and lightning. Only vitality isn't being enhanced. And lightning strike, because that will, combined with your Primal Strike, really help keep enemies pretty stun-locked. So I hope this really helped you. I hope this gave you some ideas, and some alternatives if you tire of the ranged weapon, or if you tire of specific skills. Like I said, I've left 37 points at the end here so that you can kind of flex the build into what you need or what you find your items enhancing. One of the two. Just pay very close attention to the performance of your Briarthorn, because that is the key to what you should be putting your 37 points into. Your Briarthorn should be surviving most fights. If it dies once per fight, that's fine. You should have your Summon Briarthorn off cooldown between fights. You know, it should be ready to resummon a Briarthorn the instant your first one dies. So you should not be running through 2 Briarthorns in any given fight. And if you are, the 37 points that you have left over should be dedicated to doing something about that. Whether it be decreasing the enemy's resistances and movement speed with Curse of Frailty, busting out a Primal Spirit as backup, utilizing Savagery to help it against bosses if that's what its problem is, or if it just needs a little bit of a boost, Wendigo Totem with Blood Pact to kind of keep it alive through the fight a little bit longer and get it through there. It really depends on what your Briarthorn needs. So, with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. If you like this, please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, additional suggestions for Manzarek 74, absolutely. If you have a different perspective, go for it. There's no such thing as a wrong opinion when it comes to builds. Just different perspectives. And have a great 24 hours.